Now, if you are like me, you have heard of the yellow fever, read about it in the history books, and most likely had family to die of it sometime in the early 1900s. But what is it? And does it still exist today? And what happened in 1878 to cause the worst yellow fever epidemic in USA history? All aboard the Kentucky Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. What is yellow fever? Basically, yellow fever occurs when an infected mosquito who has the virus bites a human or a primate, such as a monkey, gorilla, or others. It lasts a very short time, and the beginning of the symptoms start within 3 to 6 days after the bite, which include fever, chills, loss of appetite, muscle pains, usually in the back, headaches, and nausea. After the 5th day, the patient seems to begin to improve. However, with yellow fever, a day after improvement begins, the patient usually starts to get symptoms of liver damage, such as the skin begins to turn yellow, and the patient begins to having severe abdominal pain or cramps. Bleeding and kidney damage also can occur with this disease. If the patient dies, it usually happens within 2 weeks after the infection begins, and if they survive, then they can feel the effects of the illness for several months afterward. And sadly, yes, yellow fever still exists in areas such as Africa and South America to this very day. But now, with sanitation efforts and vaccines and a new understanding of it, yellow fever is not as prominent, and we do not see epidemics like we once did. Civil War rumors led the way to better health conditions. During the American Civil War, there had been a rumor going around in the Union-occupied New Orleans that only Union troops would be able to catch yellow fever and die. This rumor scared the troops so badly that they took precautions with the sanitation of their camps. During their occupation, they practiced quarantine procedures and covered all wells and other moist places. This quelled any outbreaks during the 1862 to 1877 years. When the troops were removed, the sanitation and quarantine rules were relaxed. This was a perfect storm for the outbreak of yellow fever in Shreveport, Louisiana, where 760 people died between August and November of 1877. Because of this epidemic, the Quarantine Act of 1878 was passed on April 26, 1878. This gave the U.S. government the right to assume control over all epidemics, but did not allow for the government to interfere with local medical authorities, health boards, or officials. This also gave the Marine Hospital Service the responsibility to stop yellow fever from coming ashore through sailors. What is interesting about the yellow fever epidemic of 1878 is at the same time, New Orleans, New York City, and Philadelphia were also being afflicted with the disease. There had been other epidemics during the years of 1855, 1867, and 1873. Each epidemic had been worse than the previous one. It is also thought that the previous epidemics were caused by yellow fever coming through the ports from West African ships carrying enslaved workers. Because the disease requires a warm, wet climate, the cities during those years had all of the ingredients needed for the disease to thrive. With little understanding of yellow fever, how it spread, and how to stop it, it left the South vulnerable to the worst epidemic of yellow fever in American history in the year of 1878. The Emily B. Souder. In March 1878, Havana, Cuba was experiencing an epidemic of yellow fever. New Orleans immediately took action and barred and detained any and all vessels coming from Cuba and Brazil. There was an inspection center set up on the Mississippi River just south of the city. It was first thought that because many of the fruit vessels were not checked properly, that many of the refugees from the 10 Years' War in Cuba might have been the cause of the yellow fever epidemic that year. On May 22, 1878, yellow fever was suspected to have originated on the steamer Emily B. Souder. The Emily B. Souder was inspected, and one sailor was removed from the ship having contracted malaria. The ship was fumigated and cleared to dock in New Orleans. However, that night, one crew member fell ill and died, with a second crew member dying 4 days later of yellow fever. After the steamer was cleared to once again travel, another ship named the Charles B. Woods arrived in New Orleans. 6 weeks after the Charles B. Woods came into the dock, the entire crew's families had contracted yellow fever. They all recovered, but a neighborhood little girl who was 4 years old died of yellow fever. She was the first recorded death in New Orleans that year. The city of New Orleans then took more action and refused any steamers in or out of their ports, and railroad systems were shut down. All workers had to be laid off in order to quell the spread of yellow fever. Before these actions went into effect, many of the city's residents left on the newly built railway system the government had rebuilt during the years after the Civil War had ended, thus spreading the disease to other parts of the South. How the yellow fever came to Memphis. The first reported cases in the area happened south of Memphis in July of 1878 in a town named Vicksburg. Memphis officials immediately reacted by putting a stop on all of its citizens traveling south out of the city. Also, all rail and steamer travel had stopped due to the imposed quarantine. This action did not go unopposed. There was a group of businessmen that threatened a lawsuit against Memphis if they did not allow a train of goods from New Orleans to enter the city. The officials relented and allowed the train to enter on July 28, 1878. If someone came down with the symptoms of yellow fever, they were immediately quarantined in an effort to keep from spreading the contagion. Often patients had to wear yellow jackets to warn others that they had been infected with the disease. But even with the city of Memphis taking this action, a steamboat worker named William Warren somehow slipped through the system, keeping out yellow fever patients. He went to Cape Bionda's fruit stand on the shore of the Mississippi on August 1, 1878. The next day he was hospitalized and taken to the President's Island for quarantine. He died shortly thereafter. Cape Bionda was the first Memphis resident to get the disease, and she would die on August 13, 1878. After that, yellow fever spread through the city of Memphis like wildfire. The yellow fever epidemic takes hold. When the first cases were known, 25,000 people who were able left the city within a week. For the most part, only African American residents remained in the city, and it seemed that the demographic of people died at a much lower rate than their Irish Catholic counterparts. There was an average of 200 people who died each day during the months of August through September of 1878, with yellow fever ending with the first frost in October. There were the constant ringing of funeral bells heard throughout Memphis during that time, with half of the city's doctors falling victim and dying of yellow fever. Memphis officials took action and established quarantine zones for those who needed to be hospitalized with the disease. It was still thought at that time that yellow fever could be spread from person to person instead of it being spread by a mosquito. So, people were cautioned from being in contact with an infected person. Also, all trade was stopped in and out of Memphis. This left the city in utter economic devastation as riots and looting now became prevalent as the city had reverted to starvation levels. Aftermath. 20,000 people died in the southeast and another 80,000 had been infected but survived the onslaught of the yellow fever epidemic. The economic impact on Memphis was estimated to be upward of $15 million in 1878. In 2023 money, that would be over an estimated $466,168,181.82 in damages. The open sewers and privies were cleaned up, and better sanitation efforts were made to improve the lives of the citizens of Memphis, thus destroying a habitat for the mosquitoes to breed. The epidemic was not declared to be officially over until November 19, 1878. Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video about the yellow fever epidemic of 1878. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.